Welcome to your Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. I'm president and CEO of Fund the People, the national organization that works to maximize investment in America's nonprofit workforce. Thanks for being here. Appreciate your time and attention. Make sure to check out fundthepeople.org for all kinds of free resources, research, tools, and other materials. On this show, we provide ideas, research, tools, and voices from across the sector with stories that help you invest in the nonprofit workforce, in your particular organization, the organizations you support, or whatever your sphere of influence is. And today, I'd like to start a series, a little mini-series, about the value of the nonprofit workforce here in the United States. Now, why do we need a series about this? Many of you work in the nonprofit sector. You're part of this nonprofit workforce. Why do you need a lecture about the value of yourself? Well, we can all use a little boost once in a while. Moreover, it's particularly important coming off of my experience at Foundations on the Hill in March of 2026, because it's clear that the nonprofit workforce has not been on the radar screen. It has not been a primary part of the agenda of the nonprofit sector in terms of advocating for itself in the halls of power. And in part, that is why Fund the People exists, because even in the associations and organizations that build nonprofit capacity or convene nonprofit leaders and philanthropy leaders, the workforce itself within our sector has just not been a major part of the agenda in a consistent and significant fashion. It's also something that has been way too off the radar screen of our elected officials. And so for those reasons and more, we're doing a mini-series here on the show to talk about what is the value of the nonprofit workforce for this country. Of course, this comes in the context of the sector being under assault by our own federal government for over a year now. That is extremely stressful for those of us who work in the sector, for the many people who've been laid off, for the people who are concerned about the stability and sustainability of their organizations. So this has been a very destabilizing time and a stressful time for the sector. And I think it's important to remind all of us that while we go through that, we must ground ourselves in why what we do is actually so important. So in this series, it's going to be in 3 parts. We're going to talk about the value of the nonprofit workforce to American communities, to the American economy, and to American democracy and liberty. On today's episode, I'm going to do 2 things. First, I'm going to talk a little bit more about why we need to talk about this. Why is it important to explicitly address the importance of the nonprofit workforce? And then I'm going to talk about the first part of the value proposition that I want to discuss, which is community, the value that the nonprofit workforce offers to our communities. So first, why do we need to really dig into this? Well, here's the thing. There has been a deficit-based approach to thinking and talking about the nonprofit workforce for a long time. And it's kind of implicit in the way we talk and think and act about the workforce. And when I say we, that could be funders, that could be nonprofit boards or executives, nonprofit workers themselves. It could be policymakers, think tanks, researchers, capacity builders, you name it. So if you stop and listen and think, we're always talking about professional development, leadership development, helping people to gain new skills or competencies. All of those things can be very important and vital, but they all have in common that they assume some deficit of knowledge, skill, etc. And not every person can know everything or be everything or have every skill. Yes, there's always room for improvement among many of us. But I think if our workforce in the nonprofit community was treated with more respect, with more seriousness, with more visibility, with more investment, with more support, then nonprofits would be able to afford and prioritize getting the skills that their staff need, helping their staff get what they need in terms of learning. So because we are so starved for respect and support, it makes it very difficult to spend the resources, to allocate resources, or even have the resources to go do learning or growth or skill development. And so that, I think, is one of the underlying problems here, is not only the lack of support and the lack of respect, but this idea that then is self-reinforcing that folks are not adequate who are in these roles, that there is some kind of deficit. So that is a key thing, a key dimension of why it's important to shift the narrative from this deficit approach to what's wrong with or what the challenge is with the nonprofit workforce to one that is more asset-based. The other thing I want to say about this sort of view of the nonprofit workforce from those in places of power, places that set the narrative about our society, prioritize how resources are allocated, or define news and conversations that are important in our society, is that the nonprofit workforce has simply been taken for granted for too long. It is so ubiquitous. It is actually so large, right? Almost 13 million Americans, 10% of the overall private workforce. And it's so embedded across every area of our lives that our workforce is invisible. It is ignored, and it is taken advantage of by a whole array of influential institutions. Most government leaders at the local, state, federal levels don't even know there is a nonprofit workforce and don't know the basic numbers of how many of us there are and how much we contribute in terms of payroll taxes or how much nonprofit employment pays members of the community, their constituents, in terms of decent jobs. And so that is a real problem. They don't even talk about us when they're talking about us, right? When they're debating potential policies like the big, beautiful bill last summer, H.R. 1, and the Medicaid cuts that are coming at the end of this year or in the new year. Those cuts are going to impact nonprofit organizations and workers in a major way. There was talk about rural hospitals are going to close. Well, I believe the majority of hospitals are nonprofit organizations. There are for-profit hospitals and medical services, and there are public government-run hospitals, government-controlled, but many hospitals are nonprofits. But that wasn't a part of the conversation. And the nonprofit workforce that will be impacted by those cuts who are paid through Medicaid reimbursements was not part of that conversation. That's just one example. There are many where they're talking about policies that will impact nonprofit organizations and workers, but nonprofit organizations and workers are never mentioned, are not even on the radar. Another example, there's no point of contact in the executive branch of our federal government. And in many of our state and local governments, it's the same thing. There's no point of contact in the legislative branch. So there's places where labor unions that represent workers in the auto industry, they know where to go to talk about labor when they need to talk to somebody in the federal government, either in Congress or in the executive branch. There is no real point of contact for nonprofits or the nonprofit workforce in the government. And we've talked about on this show before, the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't really report out about the nonprofit workforce other than every 5 years. And that data is a couple years old when it comes out. So it's nearly impossible to get current information about nonprofit employment in any rigorous fashion from our own government. And we were not included in the New Deal old age benefits initially and for decades. We were almost left out of Obamacare, nonprofits as employers. We were almost left out of PPP loans as employers and employees. with a payroll to manage. And now we have an administration that treats nonprofit workers almost like some kind of enemies to be forced out of jobs through funding cuts. So when we do get discussed in policy matters, it tends to be about overhead rates in grants and contracts from the federal government or some kind of sensationalistic and frankly very rare bad apples or some kind of fraud that certainly does happens across every sector, but is extremely rare in the nonprofit sector and is not the only thing that needs to be discussed about our sector or our workforce. And I could go on and on about how we're invisible across the media. Look at the sections of newspapers. We're invisible. Look at what we learn in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, all the way through 12th grade in high school. And then in higher education, what are the departments? What are the majors? Where do nonprofits and the nonprofit workforce and nonprofit careers show up? Are they talked about in your career center on a college campus or a community college campus? It's very rare. It's just not thought of as a career, a job, etc. That's why so many people say, yeah, I'm an accidental fundraiser. I thought I was going to be a lawyer to help make social change, and then I ended up being a social worker. Because nobody tells us this stuff as young people. Certainly that was my experience. It was extremely difficult to get good information about nonprofit jobs and careers as a young person and to really understand that the sector existed and had all these infrastructure organizations and had paid employment and how to figure all of that stuff out. We leave millions of young Americans hanging out to dry who would be predisposed to work in our sector and who are looking for that information. So this is the major set of problems that we as a workforce remain way too invisible, way too ignored, too taken advantage of, too taken for granted. And so that's why we need to be talking about the value that we offer to society. We just do. Okay. So let's get into our first value category, the value that nonprofit workers offer to their communities. Now, of course, nonprofit workforce, as I said, cuts across almost any issue area or dimension of life you could think of in any community and every community. And so it does make it difficult to quantify or talk about the particular value in any distinct way, because there is so much that nonprofit workers do across all these parts of their communities. So obviously not everyone is doing kind of direct service. We have religious institutions and staff, employees, workers in religious institutions who offer spiritual guidance, spiritual homes for community members who teach children and adults moral guidance, if you will. We have people working in higher education or after-school care or educational enrichment in the K-12 settings or in camps and other after-school, out-of-school time enrichment and mentoring and tutoring, all kinds of educational services and programs out there that help young people to learn about the world, learn about themselves, learn about each other, learn about their communities, and to stay on track in their academic journeys. We have people working in food banks and soup kitchens and domestic violence shelters and multi-service agencies and foster care, all kinds of human services that help people who are suffering and who are living on the margins of the economy or of their community, who just for one reason or another are having a hard time for whatever set of reasons. There are always people suffering, whether that's from sickness or from poverty or from war or from lack of food, whatever the reason is, whatever the thing, or lack of housing that's affordable, so many issues, so many challenges out there. Or it could be animals who are suffering, or the whole environmental movement, the whole conservation movement, and now climate change, all those things. There's just so many areas of a community that get served by and enriched by the nonprofit workforce. So I put down some categories here in my notes. Nonprofit workers are ameliorating market failure, ameliorating government failure. So where our government or businesses either refuse to do something or just do a bad job of something or actively hurt people or mess things up, it is nonprofit workers of one kind or another who are stepping in and saying, okay, if the government won't do this, we will. Or if business won't service this population because they don't think they can make a profit off of it, we will, because we're not here for the profit. On top of helping people who are suffering and making things less bad, nonprofit people enable those who have a surplus of money or time or other resources to give to others through volunteering, through giving, through activism. In that sense, nonprofit workers are facilitators of all this incredible unpaid labor and donations of time, talent, and treasure. It is the paid employees in nonprofits who steward and enable so much more giving and service through their work. And nonprofit workers elevate the quality of life in communities by creating visions about what could be, not just what's bad or what's wrong and fixing it, but what could we do differently? Imagine if we had an institution that did this. Let's go build it. And so, in a sense, the nonprofit workforce is an unspoken, maybe even unwritten part of our social contract in the United States. We think of this social contract as the implicit or explicit agreement between our government and our people. But it's not just government and people who are citizens or residents who are served by the government. It's not just this government and people. It's also nonprofits and their employees and volunteers who are there to fill in the gaps in that social contract. When that social contract gets busted up, or when government says, sorry, we don't want to raise taxes, or we want to reroute taxes, we want to cut taxes for the wealthy, so we're not going to provide these services to the poor anymore. It is nonprofits who make sure that social contract is still upheld, whether or not government funds them to do it. And we don't talk about that a lot, that at some point along the way, as this country has developed, as our laws developed, as our culture developed, and it's really in many ways been there since the beginning, that this private action for the public good is a part of how we run things. And it kind of operates on the left and the right. Conservatives like to say we need small government, return power to local communities, often meaning like state or local government, but also private sector. People on the left will say we need grassroots power, we need community power, community-based organizations and people's organizations to hold those in government to account and to push government to do more. And so oftentimes, the nonprofit workforce plays both of those roles that the right and the left both appreciate and see as valuable. But when it comes to political theory that gets taught in law schools or political science, the places that our political leaders often go to learn how to lead or run this government, that is not part of the discussion. In fact, we have this public-private dichotomy, this binary, that is the kind of widely assumed, widely understood approach that either there's the public government institutions or private for-profit business. And those are the two things that can exist as institutions. What left out of that binary is the nonprofit sector. That's why it's often in academic circles referred to as the third sector, because it's really seen as more of a Venn diagram, right, where there's some overlap among these three sectors, but the nonprofit sector is distinct. It is private, but for the public good. So it's important to help our elected officials, to help the media, to help these higher education and K-12 to see and no longer ignore this sector and this workforce, because we do provide so much value to our communities. And often those schools, those scholars, those government leaders will rely upon our sector and our workforce for that value without fully, appropriately acknowledging it in what they teach, report on, or how they think about their legislation. And it's time to change that. And we all have a role in changing that. And so again, that's why I think it's so important that we get it clear inside our sector what the value of our workforce is so that we can talk about it clearly, concisely, explicitly. So in the next couple episodes of this series here on the Fund the People podcast, we will talk about the value that the nonprofit workforce offers in the economy and in our democracy. I hope you've found this conversation useful. I'd be interested in your feedback. So if you have a moment, feel free, please, to email me, rusty@fundthepeople.org, or leave a comment in Spotify. You can leave comments on the episode or a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. If there's a way to comment or share your thoughts, I'd appreciate it. In the meantime, keep your tank full, take care of yourself, and take care of one another. I'll talk to you again soon here on your Fund the People podcast.